If you haven't seen Dairanger, I would actually recommend the show, though with one huge caveat. The series does a bunch of cool things, from some good action to a strong, enjoyable cast, and Kazu is there, but in the last 15 minutes it drops the tempo right ball hard, and if you keep that in mind, then hopefully it won't sting too badly. But if you have seen Dairanger, or don't care for heavy spoilers, I'm going to be talking about it a lot and fairly thoroughly from this point on. Dairanger ends with Ryo killing Shaddam as the Goma palace is destroyed by Dai Jin Ryu, the godlike being aiming to end all of this major conflict with absolute destruction if necessary. But with Shaddam defeated, the conflict ends, yet the characters also accept the inevitability of continued conflict, that dark and light must exist. Their enemy they fought over the past 50 episodes, Goma, returns 50 years later, and the next generation is there to stand united against them. Ideologically, I don't actually take much issue here. Rather than force some kind of perfect peace, a happily ever after, the series recognizes that conflict won't simply go away and accepts it. However, in its execution, there are several contradictions that it fails to address in the 20-minute runtime of the last episode. Firstly is the act of Ryo killing Shaddam, Ryo outright stating that he's out for vengeance due to Shaddam having killed Master Kaku, the mentor figure to the Dairangers. In enacting his vengeance with no apparent consequence, it goes against the Kujaku arc built up since the first parts of the show. Kujaku was friends with the future Goma antagonist Gaara when they were children, until Gaara was scarred protecting Kujaku. Kujaku went out to find a way to remove the scar, feeling guilty due to her role in its formation. Gaara hated that scar, but while she was afraid to connect to others for it, she believed that it would be alright as long as she still had Kujaku at her side. However, Kujaku was gone, Gaara not knowing why she left and believing she'd been abandoned. So out of her anger at the Dai tribe that rejected her, she joined Goma, intent on vengeance. During their conflict, she tricked Kujaku. Once having gone out of her way to try and heal Gaara's scar, she was led astray by her own vanity, her pride in her own unmarred beauty, becoming trapped for 6,000 years. Upon being freed, she was burning with anger, intending to destroy Gaara, her dwindling life secondary to that desire. However, her self-destructive path would not leave herself as the only one at risk. Daigo, not wanting Kujaku to come to harm, risked himself to protect her. After seeing the effects her actions indirectly had on others, Kujaku pushed from her self-destructive path because she didn't want others to be hurt for her sake. In the time she had left, she came to find out the truth of Gaara's vengeance. Gripped with guilt over having unintentionally abandoned her own friend, when she finally found the peacock tear that might have elongated her own life, she used it not to live even a moment longer, but to put Gaara's heart to rest, healing her as she'd intended to so many years ago. Passing on to the afterlife, she would meet Gaara once again, the two able to reconcile, and only because Kujaku was able to move on past the hatred and desire for vengeance she'd once held onto for 6,000 years. Hatred and violence is unsustainable and only leads to more conflict and suffering, something shown not just here, but in Goma's structures as a whole. Yet, Ryo falling prey to these desires is accepted as a means to an end. That falling to hatred and darkness is fine if it means ending a conflict. The ending states that shadow must exist for light to exist, which, compared to the show's prior exploration of Kiryoku, the spiritual power possessed by all of nature, and Yoryoku, the corruption of that nature, doesn't quite line up. Aiming to surpass nature, Ryo's father, Choryo, a member of the Dai tribe who went to Goma to learn Yoryoku, combined the two in his martial arts, stating the exact thing mentioned in the ending: the acceptance that light and shadow must both exist. However, while in the ending, it's Kaku stating this as truth, in episode 7, Kaku had a retort, stating that shadow is merely a byproduct of the light. While it does exist, it's not preferable or ideal. Shadow cannot exist without light, leaving Kiryoku dominant. This statement proved to be true in the following episode. Though he went to Goma, seeking eternal life through combining Ki and Yo into the ultimate martial art, he still desired love, finding it through a bond that created Ryo and his sister, and that love and desire to protect would push him to stand against Goma to save him. His actions reveal his own contradiction. Even if darkness exists, he ultimately yearns for light, proving Kaku's words regarding Kiryoku's dominance. And much later, Ryo walking down the path of his father and Kaku quoting words he'd once rejected near verbatim, all occurs without reflection or a consistent thematic response. That pivot to hatred is something we see much of through Goma. While the Dai tribe is a scattered bunch pushed together by necessity, Goma is much more rigidly structured. Their organization, a hierarchy that places high value on blood relations. Yet despite the importance placed on those bonds, in their obligation they are rejected. Shaddam may be Akamaru's father, but he had no love for the boy, and Akamaru directs his hate everywhere, including back at his father. With Goma's systems perpetuating hatred and control, they easily sacrifice others for their own ends. The idiot trio were leftovers, monsters deemed by Goma to be worthless, their repeated failures expected after a point even though they strove to be better than their losses, their eventual rejection of the system one that led to them leaving it. The harm of their systems in particular is evoked through Ko, whose blood threatens to push him into Goma. Akamaru, wanting to see him fall, tries to strip him of his mother's love, corrupting him to be so much like himself. But that mother loved both of them. Those feelings actualized as they surpassed Ko's blood and allowed him to live his life freely without Goma's controlling structures. And the promise of that love pushed Akamaru to be with their mother in his last moments, in spite of how he'd been raised under Goma and the blood that ran through his veins. Time and time again, love and the desire to protect win out, but the temptation of Yoryoku is strong. Master Kaku, desiring peace, never fought in the war of 6,000 years ago, despite being on the side of Goma. As such, he was never faced with the loss that drove Shaddam to turn many of those who died, even himself, into mud puppets. Hollow beings propping up a hollow system that could only be sustained by force of hatred and will. The natural result of a group defined by authority, treachery, and war. But though he left those systems, Kaku still carried with him parts of their ideology and practice he couldn't shed from himself. As a parental authority figure to the Dairangers, in working against them to maintain peace by forcibly taking their power and defeating them, he expects them to be obedient to him and reliant on him. Raised in Goma, their authoritative nature was one he still evoked, despite having left them. Though he acted in love, his methods still carried echoes of Goma he couldn't escape. The reliance on and unison of Kiryoku and Yoryoku one that would bring him to ruin, while the Dairangers proved they didn't need to rely on him. Though they were younger, it was because of that they could still grow and find the will and strength to protect what they cared about on their own, power or no. The flawed systems of Goma were shown to be unsustainable, built on sacrifice, drowned in hatred, and resistant to change, with their young being beholden to their old. And yet, even though their structure was shown as hollow and broken, Goma still exists 50 years later, somehow. Though Goma had many users of Yoryoku, there is still a distinction, and what is served by the continued practice of Yoryoku in the world, as opposed to the continued existence of Goma, is where a fine line is drawn. While a perfect peace is understandably too ideal, Ryo doesn't need to accept violence by committing it needlessly himself, in killing an antagonist who was already long dead in a palace that was already on its last legs due to Dai Jin Ryu. Goma didn't need to come back when everything presented shows them as unsustainable rather than absolute. Acceptance of strife is understandable, but there's a difference between accepting that there will be struggle and conflict, or resigning oneself to the idea that what one struggles against is eternal, which is why I think that the ending can be seen as unsatisfying. Even if the Dai tribe was set to struggle later against Yoryoku, an aspect of nature, it didn't have to be against Goma, a flawed and human structure that would naturally be expected to end given time. Total destruction only made sense for Goma, their refusal to stop fighting resulting in their destruction at the hands of Dai Jin Ryu. Dai Jin Ryu rejects conflict, destroying those who fight to bring peace and balance to the universe. Though he's ultimately stopped when Goma is destroyed, which is hardly a balanced resolution if light and shadow are both to exist, as said in the final episode, he also doesn't return when Goma does. What I believe Dai Jin Ryu is meant to evoke is one of the fundamentals at the core of Dairanger. Martial arts may be a violent means, violence being what Dai Jin Ryu rejects, but the practice of martial arts is not in support of violence, but self-defense and bettering of the self. Top-level practitioners are often legally considered dangerous for their skill, and learning or using one's martial arts skill for violence is crossing an important line. This divide is touched on in the conflict between Ryo and Jin. Jin is a martial artist of violence, crushing dojos to show his skill and killing senselessly for the satisfaction of being the best, where Ryo merely wants to protect what's close to him. In the end, even after trying to cut away that which he wanted to protect to better refine his ideals and power as a warrior of violence, in coming to respect Ryo, he could no longer easily accept his hatred, instead rejecting the Goma who'd given him power. On the flip side, you have Kameo, The current form of an ancient turtle who'd hidden from the conflict of 6,000 years ago due to his pacifistic desires, Kameo was pushed into action because his friend Kazu was in danger. One who is not a martial artist evoking the spirit of that practice as a means to protect what he cares about, much like Ryo, joining the team as a regular fighter. With this ideology understood, the framing of Kiryoku and Yoryoku as light and shadow is easy to understand, with self-defense and betterment of the self as the ideal, the light, and violence for gain as a corruption of that strength, something that will be likely to exist, but is not ideal for it to exist. Dai Jin Ryu rejects the kind of senseless violence that martial arts isn't meant to be, but meant to respond to. A violence that Ryo becomes complicit in at the end of the conflict as light and shadow both become necessary. That violence for personal gain and hatred need to exist, being one against everything the show, and martial arts itself, stands for. Maybe you're wondering how I might fix the ending. Honestly, I don't really intend to offer helpful critique given the huge barrier between my skill as a writer, any cultural differences, and the time period in which I could have this discussion relative to Dairanger. But to give an answer anyway, I'd learn Japanese, time travel back to the 1980s, get a career in writing 50-episode children's television shows, a skill I respect more and more as I write in my free time, then maybe somehow try to see what the heck happened and arrange for a more conclusive ending, like having Ryo not kill Shaddam, or instead die in the aftermath of his killing, pushing the others to refuse the cycle of violence while still preparing for potential future threats. The ending not involving the return of Goma, but merely the remaining Dairangers as mentors to some new generation fighting a new threat. But with that said, while much of this video was spent explaining the build-up to the lacking payoff, ultimately I don't want that to be the main takeaway. What keeps me enjoying much of Dairanger is in the build-up. So even if the payoff didn't satisfy me, and even if my personal opinion of the series as a whole was cut down a bit by that ending, ultimately my feelings are still positive on it. Ryo and Jin's conflict going from a hostile to a mere rivalry, Kaku's flawed mentorship pushing him against those who he'd previously offered assistance to, Rin and Shoji being major figures in the Dairangers' makeshift family with Ko, Shoji giving Goma monsters a chance where no one else did, Kujaku's vengeance quest growing cold with guilt, Ko in general growing from a little snot into an actual hero, Kazu's fashion choices. As important as the ending is, it's not paramount. While I see the ending of Dairanger as one that goes against much of the well-constructed build-up, it doesn't ruin the show or annul what came before. Or at least it doesn't for me. Hell, on a potential rewatch, it can no longer surprise me, so even if Goma is still around, that bitter taste might be long gone. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons, Mr. Cynical, Flarbu, Thanks Naturalrad, Maz, Brorike, Mohammed Akim, Tengoon, Alvermort, Bayanort, Gloogle, and Offline But Not. Thank you for watching.